After the recent outrage in the Middle East, there's been a lot of talk about intelligence failures. This is something we hear again and again and again. We heard it for September 11th. We've heard it for all sorts of things. September 11th especially, because there's a lot of talk about Saudi involvement. Vivek Ramaswamy has suggested that there was Saudi involvement. I want to explain the so-called intelligence failures. You can call them failures if you like, but I'm quoting here. I'm going to read a passage from Tragedy and Hope. If you're not familiar with it, this is one of the most important books ever written, because Professor Quigley was a self-confessed insider. He knew what he was talking about, and aside from that, everything about the book explains a lot of things which most people don't generally understand. His explanation of the Cuban Missile Crisis is absolutely excellent. Anyway, here he is. Bear in mind, this is the 1960s. That's what I think here. All past history shows that espionage has been generally successful and intelligence has been generally a failure. By this I mean that no country had much success in keeping secrets in the 20th as in all earlier centuries, but neither has any other country had much success in evaluating or in interpreting the secrets it obtained. The so-called surprises of history have emerged not because other countries did not have the information, but because they refused to believe it. My apologies for the creaking desk. The date of Hitler's attack on the West in May 1940 had been given to the Netherlands by the German Counterintelligence Office as soon as it was decided. The Western countries refused to believe it. The same was true of every one of Hitler's surprises. Stalin was given the date of the German attack on the Soviet Union by a number of informants, including the United States Department of State, but he refused to believe. Both the Germans and the Russians had the date of D-Day, but ignored it. The United States had available all the Japanese coded messages, knew that war was about to begin, and that a Japanese fleet with at least 4 large carriers was loose and lost in the Pacific, yet Pearl Harbor was a total surprise. This last point was so hard to believe once the evidence was available that the same groups who were focusing on Soviet espionage in 1948 to 55 were also claiming that President Roosevelt expected and wanted Pearl Harbor. He says in brackets here, actually this is true. Roosevelt had been conspiring for some time to get the US involved in World War II. The President and others devised a plan by leaving Pearl Harbor open to attack, knowing this would arouse the American people and he could declare war on Japan and thus enter the war. The collusion of the President with Marshall and others has been well documented today with irrefutable evidence. He goes on. The whole purpose of secrecy in government should not be to keep information from other states. This is almost impossible, but to make it as difficult as possible for other states to get certain information, so that when they do get such restricted information, it will be so intermingled with other information and misinformation that it cannot be evaluated promptly enough to do them much good. Any espionage system gets more information than it can handle rapidly. Any country should assume that the enemy has all its own secret information. The lessons of past history fully support this assumption. Following every war, the discovery is made that the enemy during the war had every other state's most cherished secrets. In fact, the most successful kind of counter-espionage work is achieved not by preventing access to secrets, but by permitting access to information which is not true. This was done most successfully in 1943 in preparing the American invasion of Sicily, which was a surprise to the Germans because they had been provided through their espionage in Spain with false information about an invasion of the Balkans. The Germans had a somewhat similar success through their Operation North Pole, by which the Germans successfully took over and operated the French underground and the associated British espionage net in a large part of France for about a year. Finally, it is not generally recognised by outsiders that almost all information gathered by any espionage net is non-secret material fully available to anyone as public information. He goes on here to discuss the atomic spy cases, and this is very interesting. He says the earliest of these was the arrest of Soviet naval lieutenant Redin by the FBI on March 26, 1946, on charges that a Seattle naval engineer, Herbert Kennedy, had sold Redin secrets about the Bikini test ship Yellowstone for $250. Bikini was the first hydrogen bomb explosion. This case was a forerunner of others in respect to two false assertions in news releases. One, claims by the FBI that information leading to the apprehension of Redin had come from the Guzenko atomic spy case in Canada, February 1946, and two, claims by the HUAC, that's the House Un-American Affairs Committee, or the House Committee on American Activities, it's best enunciated as, claims by HUAC that it had unearthed this significant case. Redin was eventually acquitted when his defence showed that Kennedy had been paid for research he did for Redin in the Seattle Public Library. Neither Guzenko nor HUAC had anything to do with it. Now let's consider a hypothetical example. September 10th, 2001, a man walks into a police station in Leicester or Birmingham and asks to speak to a detective. He gets to see one. What can I do for you, Mr. Mohammed? I want to advise you that there is a plot to cause serious damage in America with 4 terrorist attacks. Oh yes, yes. They're going to hijack 4 planes, crash 2 of them into the Twin Towers, 1 on the White House, 1 on the Pentagon. Oh really? And where did you get this information from? Well, I heard 2 men discussing it in the mosque on Friday. Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed. What will they do? What will the police do? Probably nothing. Then after the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and the Shanksville flight, after the truth dawns on them, what would they do? They'd cover it up, wouldn't they? I think that's what happened with the Saudis as well. I don't think there was any Saudi involvement as such with 9/11, whatever the antecedents of the hijackers. So I certainly don't believe the Saudi government was involved in it. But it would be embarrassing, very embarrassing, and they cover up. I'll show you another example of something that could have been a cover-up. In case you don't recognise him, the man in this photograph is the notorious serial killer John Gacy. The woman is the First Lady of the United States. A few months after this photograph was taken, Gacy was arrested. He was active in Democratic Party politics at the local level. There's nothing sinister about this photograph, but you can imagine what some crank could have made of it, especially if it had been suppressed, if attempts had been made to suppress it to hide embarrassment. I think this is where a lot of this conspiracy mongering comes from. I'm not saying there aren't conspiracies, of course there are, you know, I mean, like the gunpowder plot was a conspiracy. There's been a lot more since then. But it's very easy to make something sinister out of something innocuous. In December 1952, the serial killer John Reginald Halliday Christie murdered his wife. Shortly he would murder 3 more women, then pack a suitcase and walk off into almost oblivion. When his crimes came to light, there was a big appeal put out for him, and there were sightings of him from all over the place. I've actually studied the original files at Kew, and people literally saw Christie here, there, everywhere, including abroad. He was arrested shuffling along the Thames embankment. He hadn't been out of the capital. All this information, most of it in good faith, probably all of it in good faith, submitted to the police, and nothing came of it. Ted Bundy could have been caught fairly on in his career because the police were looking for a man named Ted who drove a Volkswagen. It wasn't until he kidnapped Carol DeRonch and she escaped from him and reported him that the finger was really pointed at him. His girlfriend had suspicions, but you know, girlfriends are girlfriends. And it's well to mention here the case of Stephen Lawrence and his daffy mother Doreen, who now sits in the House of Lords. She was very unhappy that the police hadn't gone out and arrested the gang who murdered her precious son immediately. She complained, why? They thought because he was a black boy who was involved in drug dealing, they started investigating him and us. Well, yes, this is called lines of inquiry. They have to investigate every possibility and every non-possibility. This is the way investigations work. And very often, in a high-profile murder case or some terrorist case, some big case which attracts a lot of publicity, the police get information coming at them from all directions. And this applies to national security as well. You know, the guy next door with a funny sounding name who has strange visitors at strange hours may be perfectly innocuous. You know, perhaps he's into kinky sex with other men. That wouldn't be kinky, that would be perverted, but you get what I'm saying. So really, as Professor Quigley says, espionage has been spectacularly successful. Intelligence, far less so. Terrorist groups and terrorist organisations often put out false information to distract the police and the security services. So while they go running off in one direction, they're planting bombs somewhere else. Anyway, that's how it works.